Coming to you live at STD Engage 2019 in Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome to Something Positive for Positive People. I'm Courtney Brain. Something Positive for Positive People is an intentionally inclusive hub of sex-positive resources aimed to equip people who are affected by STIs with the tools they need in order to navigate stigma. My guest today is Amanda Dennison. Is that how you say your name?
Yes, it is.
She, her pronouns?
Yes.
Awesome.
Thanks for asking.
I don't know where to start. So I told you I wasn't going to read your
Right.
article, but I read it. So I have to sit here and play stupid. So you are positive for genital HSV-2, is that correct?
That's right.
And how long ago were you diagnosed?
Gosh, it was July 2015 when I was
Oh.
when I was diagnosed. So
All right. And was this the first time you ever opened up about it? Was when that article came out? How long ago was that?
that was in April of this year.
Okay, so April
And
2019.
Yeah, that was the first time that I had publicly come out. Not even that many people in my personal life knew.
Yeah.
So,
What gave you the courage to do so?
you know, I work for NCSD. We are a sex-positive organization. We talk a lot about engaging community members and what we're doing. But I felt like, how are we going to engage them if no one around here is telling their own stories? And it felt a little hypocritical to say, oh, we want people to tell their stories, but no one in our organization was. So one day I had a conversation with my boss, and I just said, we want to do this. I'd be more than willing to share my story. And of course he jumped on that and said, yes, absolutely. STD Awareness Month was coming up the following month. It seemed like the perfect time to kind of launch this initiative called STD Voices and share my story to get it started.
Awesome. Was there any fear behind it at first? I know you mentioned bringing it to your boss. Were you worried about any sort of stigma you'd face from your employer?
Yeah, even though, right, we're the National Coalition of STD Directors. We work with STDs all the time. We represent people who work in the STD prevention field. I still was nervous about any stigma or judgment or shame I would get from my coworkers. That didn't happen though, luckily. They're they're all very, very supportive.
I feel like being in the sex positive field, you're met with a lot more receptive people who
Absolutely.
are understanding and I think just are generally aware of the statistics of how common STIs are. So when you tell them, hey, I have an STD, they probably wouldn't even bat an eye. Was that kind of what you were met with by peers?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a lot of thanks for sharing, thanks for stepping up and being the first to share your story. A lot of appreciation and just general support from them.
Yeah, I noticed that it's really easy for people to share their STI stories when they can say, I had chlamydia, I had syphilis, I had gonorrhea, but not many are open to saying, I have an STI.
Right.
Is that something that you've noticed as well?
Yeah, it's really easy to say you got some antibiotics and you're good to go, whereas, you're living with an STI, right? So there's the constant disclosure and conversations that take place around it. Whereas if you had something before, it's not something you have to think about or share. I appreciate when people share their stories. That's still empowering to other, community voices. But yeah, it's a different energy around those conversations.
Yeah, for sure. Now, being in the public health space and having received a positive diagnosis, were you already in the public health space?
Yes, I had been in STD and HIV prevention for almost 5 years before I was diagnosed.
Oh, so you were in here for 5 years, and when it happened, were you just kind of like, what the F?
Oh yeah. I don't even know if there was a lot of personal shame associated with my diagnosis. I felt like a professional failure. Like, how was I supposed to do my job of preventing STDs and HIV if I myself got one? That was the biggest, I think, challenge for me coming to, getting to a place of accepting my diagnosis. For a long time, and I didn't tell anyone at my previous job. It wasn't until I got here, almost 4 years later, that I said something to coworkers. So that was a big shock, even if, I felt like I did things right, and I followed advice that I had given patients at the clinic I had worked at, and and whatnot, I still ended up with an STD, and it was just kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah. And so when you received your diagnosis, what was the interaction like with the person with the care provider?
Oh, sure. So I had never seen this provider before. My regular provider, I think, was out on maternity leave. So, she walks in and she's got on like green scrubs and clogs, and she's really pleasant, but also very like quick and dismissive in her conversation with me.
So she's like, "You've got herpes. All right, I gotta go."
Yeah, it was, it was strange. There wasn't a lot of time for me to like process and come up with questions. It was, yeah, this looks like an outbreak. Let me swab it. That hurt like hell. And then, okay, well, it's July 4th weekend coming up, so you're gonna have to wait like a week for your results. In the meantime, here's some prescriptions. On your way out, make your appointment, bye.
Yeah.
And I knew. I mean, I had been in the field long enough to know what was happening. But I waited. I didn't tell anybody until I got my results. When I came back from my results, it was just, yeah, like we thought, it's herpes. It came back HSV2. Keep taking your medication, and if you want, we can get you on, the daily dose of acyclovir going forward. And that was kind of it. Still, like, she didn't take a sexual history on me, which, being in this field, I was just, what? What do you mean? I'm being diagnosed with an STD, and you're not taking a sexual history. I had to ask for other STD tests. I didn't think I was at risk for other things, but I'm like, I'm being diagnosed with one.
That's interesting.
I should be tested for all of them.
Yeah.
No conversation about how to disclose to current partners or past partners, or even how far back I should go in telling partners. I wasn't out to my doctor as a queer woman at the time, so there was no discussion about, how to tell different partners. So it was just all very strange. And I walked out to my car and I was like, what do I do now?
I was met with a different experience. So when I was diagnosed, I was also tested for the other STIs.
Mm-hmm.
I was tested for the curable ones and HIV, and I was given medication, I believe, that would have treated chlamydia, one of the curable ones. I was just given the treatment for that,
Mm-hmm.
and my medication for the herpes. So when I left out of there, I had all of this taken care of. So it's really shocking to me that it's not common practice to be tested for other STIs
Right.
when you're diagnosed with an STI. And it really does make me question how we as people who have herpes view herpes, how those who believe they aren't affected by or are negative for herpes, and then how the medical community views herpes.
Mm-hmm.
So like even being here at STD Engage, I noticed that a lot of the conversation is HIV, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis focused, and trick's been up there, but not herpes. And it's come up in some of the small meetings, but it's only been called HSV2,
Mm-hmm.
as if HSV1 can't be transmitted genitally.
Yeah.
I guess what my question is to you now is like, do you have any insight as to why that is?
Yes. And that all comes from, I think, what's funded on a national level, right? So the nationally reportable diseases, things that are reported from labs to state and local health departments, which then gets reported to CDC, are gonorrhea, chlamydia, and syphilis. Herpes isn't reported.
Not even trick?
Trick's not reported. Chancroid is, but there's like,
Well, we
I
gotta talk
don't-
about that one later.
I don't even know how many cases of that there are, probably less than a handful every year. And so there's no discussion around herpes because health departments aren't working on herpes, right? Like that's not a conversation. Now, when I worked at a clinic, I had conversations about it all the time, right? I had people coming in to get tested for HIV because they were diagnosed with herpes, and like me, they didn't get offered other tests, so they walked into my clinic to get those tests. So I had conversations there, and even when I was at the health department, the state health department, I got calls all the time about, concern around somebody's out there spreading herpes, or I know so-and-so has herpes. And there was a lot of conversation around stigma and shame and how to disclose to partners. And that was even before I was diagnosed myself. But yeah, as a health department provider, or managing an STD prevention program, it's not something that's reported. So, and it's not something that's well funded. Like, research isn't funded a lot around herpes, although they are working on a vaccine for it. I guess it's not as sexy as some would say, as the others.
And I would think that just collecting the experiences of people who've talked to me, it's been, to me, more of a matter of there's an absence of a sense of urgency as a result of the stigma. Because people have the ability to step up and say, hey, I'm affected by this STI. I would like to protect my partners better. Where's the vaccine? There's no demanding it, but in order to do that, you have to put yourself out there.
Right.
There are all kinds of petitions and campaigns that are going on right now to advocate for this, but the numbers of people who have herpes versus the number of people who are suffering from herpes, they don't match up. And of course, HIV being something that can lead to fatalities, we're looking at way more of a sense of urgency for there. For syphilis, it can lead to infertility. And then we have all of these additional long-term effects of the curable STI. So I understand the urgency there, and getting people to really rally behind more herpes support really puts us in position of compromising our anonymity, our safety, I guess. So, I mean, are you aware of any of these kinds of efforts that are going on?
Mass advocacy efforts? No.
Yeah. And I say this, I don't want to put you on the spot, but this is just something to make the listener think about. If you're someone who is, in fact, living with herpes, I say herpes, including HSV1 orally and genitally, HSV2 orally and genitally, that's what I'm talking about. So these are the ones that aren't getting any kind of attention, and there are so few people who are suffering from chronic outbreaks. More of us were affected by the social stigma, if nothing else. And that same thing that we have the power to negate, neutralize, whichever is the best word, is the same thing that's keeping us from neutralizing it. So it's just this cycle of, this is what I need to do in order to alleviate myself from the stigma, and this is the reason that I can't do that very thing. So, I mean, I get it, but I just want to make sure that people are aware, there are efforts out there, and there's multiple ways that people are able to get involved. My next question for you, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that's great. I think a lot of it has to do with education. People feel alone when they are diagnosed, but they don't realize how many people are affected by it. And when you tell them, the CDC estimates that 1 in 5 people are living with genital herpes, and that you think, the number of partners you may have, you're like, oh my, 20% of them potentially have it. And then as someone who knows their status, like, you are then empowered to kind of interrupt that transmission and to keep yourself safe. And there's not a lot of that conversation until people realize just how many people are actually affected by it.
Well, someone once said, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
And in this instance, with great empowerment comes great unwanted responsibility. We don't want to have these conversations, and you can feel free to share here, but it wasn't until I received my herpes diagnosis that I began to have these conversations. Before, for me, it was always are you on birth control? All right, let's move forward. And I know condom or no condom, and I always had this assumption that STIs had a smell and some kind of an odor or physical visible symptoms, or a person would be in such pain that they wouldn't want to have sex.
Right.
So these were kind of my 3 assumptions as a result of the information that I was given. and the sex ed programs, if you can even call them that. In my health class, I
Right.
was associated with PE
Mhm.
more than anything. So just with that additional empowerment, it may seem like a burden for a lot of people.
When you know, right, there's an expectation that you tell everybody. Um, and we're not, I don't want to use the word training, but we're not preparing people to have these conversations, even, one-on-one with partners, let alone telling the world about it.
You know, we're not, and that's unfortunate. I think that there should be more of an emphasis, not necessarily on us having to disclose our status, but more so on the receptivity of the conversation in general. So
Absolutely.
if people are empowered to have the conversation, yes, I mean, nobody wants an STI. No one's out here, I'm lying, there's a kink, and or kink fetish, one of the two. Bug chasing, have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so that's probably the only exception to this conversation. But for the most part, people aren't asking for an STI. It's just something that happens.
Mhm.
And we have this expectation centered around, I don't know what, that it cannot happen to us. It takes one time. I know people who've had hundreds of partners who've never gotten an STI,
Yep.
and I know people who've had one partner and gotten an STI.
Mhm.
So we have to get to a place where we're aware that this can happen, and we need to be presented with the resources that we need in order to take care of ourselves. Every STI at this point in time is either curable, treatable, or manageable, and that's that. We treat them like now all of a sudden, our identities are so attached to what we believe to be true about STIs in general.
Mhm.
So if we can just accept them as a health status or a change in health status so that whoever's treating us is able to treat us, then I think that it helps us to navigate the stigma a little bit better as well.
Right. On Tuesday evening, we had a young person speak at the opening.
Was this Addison?
Addison.
Addison, yeah.
Amazing. They
Yes.
are amazing. But they said, a lot of people think STDs are bad because sex is bad, and that having an STD is like a mark on your character, when all it is a medical diagnosis.
That's it.
In the same way that we would treat any other medical diagnosis, whether that's managing it or curing it, that needs to be the same conversation here.
Same exact thing. And society just has this cringe about the word sex.
Yes.
And it's so interesting. Everybody wants to do it, but so few are comfortable with talking about it.
Mhm.
And why aren't we at a place where we can comfortably have these conversations of what everyone's doing, between medical professional to patient, parent to child, youth to educator. All of these barriers are just compounding the things that make us feel the way we do once
Mhm.
we receive a positive diagnosis. So, question about when you were diagnosed, did you feel like your identity was challenged or shifted being a healthcare professional and now having an STI? Was there any sort of inner conflict at all?
Sure, like I said, I felt like a professional failure. Like I couldn't do my job anymore. Like now I harbored some big secret that I couldn't share with anybody. It completely changed the way that I lived kind of my romantic or sexual life, which was vastly different than pre-diagnosis. So yeah, there was a shift until I kind of accepted it, and as I said in my opening statements, felt empowered by it. And that took months to get to a place where it was like, okay, well, I'm the one with the virus. I'm the one who has the knowledge. I'm not, the ignorant person asking me if their legs touching mine under a dinner table would give them herpes. And I'm not joking about that.
I believe you. Was there any stigma that may have taken place, like in your workplace, from other medical professionals, maybe before your diagnosis and then you may have noticed it after? Because I find that there are people who don't necessarily pay attention to it until they're affected by it, and then you just notice it everywhere.
Sure, I don't know if well, I can't say I didn't notice it. But nothing specific to herpes, I don't believe, but more so we worked in the STD field. I worked with DIS, or disease intervention specialists, who were out interviewing newly diagnosed syphilis and HIV patients, and they talk about their cases. We have meetings where we do case reviews, and you would always kind of hear a little bit of stigma or shame among those conversations, and I think I noticed it more and more after being like on the other side.
Yeah.
Sure, I wasn't diagnosed with syphilis. I didn't have to interact with the DIS as someone diagnosed with herpes, but there's almost a bit of like camaraderie there. Like, if you're talking about this person, what would you say about me
Yes.
if you knew?
hmm Yeah, I'm curious to know how I would have handled that, and I challenge anyone listening to ask themselves, if you've noticed any uptick in stigmatizing language being used around you. Obviously, more people who find themselves here are positive for HSV. How do you deal with that? My personal advice would just be to ask yourself why you feel the way you feel and begin to bring awareness into that and allow yourself to, of course, feel the feeling, but you've got to also challenge your beliefs about yourself with experiences moving forward. Do you have any suggestions on your end on how a person can deal with the internalized stigma?
I think even if you find one person that you can talk to, whether it's your best friend or your partner at the time, if you find one person who is supportive, I think you learn that you find other people who are supportive. And all it takes is kind of one positive experience of telling somebody. And whenever I get messages from folks being like, how do I tell people? How do you disclose? My experience was, when I started disclosing, was far more positive than negative. I had one negative experience with the guy with the dinner table question, but everybody else was very accepting.
You should have told him you already had it.
Chances are. But yeah, I think there's, if you can get to the point of just telling one person and starting to talk through those feelings, even if that one person is a counselor, is a therapist, and you start working through some of that, it is so helpful. I think it is very difficult to kind of sit in silence with all those thoughts and all those feelings and not talking about them with somebody. Like I said, therapist, family member, friend, counselor, a trusted coworker or something. But I think as soon as you put a voice to what is happening, it starts unraveling a bit.
Mm-hmm. And not talking about it, that's what the virus wants. The virus wants to remain a secret because that's where it thrives, in that place of shame. The more we stress ourselves out and trying to hide this and keep it under wraps and hidden and maybe not disclose, the more this virus is able to thrive. Because think about it, stress is a trigger for many of us. I want to say, if not all of us. So being under the stress of going into a new sexual relationship with someone and having not disclosed, this is often increasing our stress levels to where the virus is able to express itself. So it's important for us to establish a better relationship with our bodies and be able to get to a place where we can communicate our status to our partners. And I'm aware of the very specific communities of people who are at risk of physical violence for disclosing. So I want to make sure, again, to just hold space here for them as well. But if you are someone who has the privilege, then it's your place to disclose your status to your sexual partners. Let's talk about sex.
Let's do it.
I'm often met by people who don't directly ask. How they say it is, no one's gonna love me, how am I gonna have a family? And after talking to them for a while, it really boils down to, who's gonna wanna have sex with me?
Yeah. I think kind of the number one concern when it comes to this.
Yeah, and so as far as dating and disclosure goes, you did mention that you identify as queer,
Yes.
are queer. How do I say this? Because I'm still learning language. So are you queer or do you identify as queer?
So that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. I identify as queer. I am queer. It's just, yeah.
Okay. Now, for queer people, I'm aware that there are discrepancies or discrimination from the medical community oftentimes. There's discrimination. Have you faced any of that at all?
Discrimination in the way that, the assumptions that are made. So the assumptions that as a woman, I'm only sleeping with men, or only sleeping with other heterosexual men who, you're not asking me about who my partners are also sleeping with. And also only assuming that I am in a monogamous relationship is another part of it. And not asking about how many partners, the gender identities of my partners, what types of sex I'm engaging in. So I have not come out to the vast majority of my providers.
Yeah. Was it easier for you to step into the public space as a queer person than it was for you to say, I have herpes?
It's funny you bring that up because the day I came out to my boss as having herpes was the same day I came out to him as being queer. We had the conversation about herpes, and then I went to my email. I left his office, was checking my email, and found out that I was going to be honored as one of the 40 under 40 queer women of DC. And I was like, oh, this would be really great to kind of, to share with the team. And so I forwarded it to him, and I just said, well, since I'm coming out to you about everything else, I might as well come out to you about this too. And so I kind of just came out as all at one time to my coworkers. But previously, in my personal life, it was a lot easier. Not that it was easy.
Yeah.
But it felt easier to come out as queer, especially to, family members, than it did to have an open conversation around having an STD.
Now, how crazy is that? Because I think it demonstrates how far we've come as a society, really. I think about people I've known who have eventually come out, so to speak, and there's got to be a better way of saying that
Right.
other than coming out. But the people I know who've come out about their sexual orientation, their sexual preferences, when they stepped into that space, there was so much fear around it. There was so much fear of judgment, of abandonment from the communities that you belong to. And now we're at a place where people are able to come out and be celebrated more so than shamed.
Right.
I am very, very hopeful for us getting to that same place as far as sex positivity and being able to discuss STI status. We shouldn't have to talk about coming out. We should be talking about being where we are, being who we are. And there shouldn't be any question about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have come a long way in terms of accepting different sexual identities, gender identities, all of that. But in terms of talking about sexual practices, totally different.
Oh, yeah.
Not that it should be, right? Like it's all a part of kind of someone's identity and how we live our lives, right? But talking about an STD means you're engaging in the sexual acts that got you to a place of having an STD, right? So that's where we don't go. Like the conversation ends.
And that's unfortunate because that's really where the conversation needs to stay.
Right.
We need to continue to talk about this. So we're going to have sex. We're going to continue to do so. So how can we engage in conversations that allow for us to set a foundation where that's standard? It should be a standard for us to discuss STIs. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Evelyn Dacker. She is the executive director of Sex Positive Portland, and I had her on the podcast, episode 99. She did a TED Talk called Stars, and It started with, it was an acronym for sexual or STD status, turn-ons, avoids, relationship intention, and then the final S was for safety. And I think that that really sets a solid foundation for how we can talk about sex in a very conscious way, because not only are we talking about our STI status, we're talking about our kinks, what turns us on, things that can be done consensually. Like now we're getting into consent.
Right.
So we're talking about these are things I like, what are things you like, these are things I don't like, what are the things that you don't like. And then relationship intention, is this going to be casual? Is this going to be monogamous? Are we working towards marriage? Are we just going to not ever see each other again? And then we get to the other S, which is safety, and that just branches out into just letting a friend know that you're going to be staying with so-and-so, so
Right.
that they know where you are, letting the person know that, hey, I'm turning my GPS on. I've already told 50 people. Like, I made a Facebook status saying where I'm going to be at. So if you try anything, you're effed. So I find that to be a very good foundation for a good core of topics, and us beginning to discuss sex, sexual health, and having that kind of a conversation. So do you have anything that you feel is like something that needs to be added there?
No, I think that sums it up. I identified as polyamorous for a really long time, and there was a podcast that I listened to that, was made up of a bunch of poly folks. But it was like, what's your elevator speech when you get into a relationship? Like, what are things that you want your partner to know, or a potential partner to know, and how to convey that in a way that is, it hits on consent, it hits on what you like, what your limits are, what are hard stops, having a conversation around STIs, condoms, or other forms of, protection or prevention, and kind of like how to have that conversation. And I think that STAR's, kind of topic areas that you just laid out is a kind of a perfect summation of, what we wanted to have in that elevator speech.
Shameless plug. I mean, we've got all kinds of resources similar to this on the Something Positive for Positive People podcast. So all of the perspectives that we're bringing on here are really useful to people who are navigating a positive STI diagnosis, and also for people who are potentially dating someone who may have an STI. So these are all very useful tools in order to help you to navigate that. Now, as far as disclosing goes, do you have a particular way that you do it, or is it on a case-by-case basis? Especially being someone who's queer, who doesn't just have sex with someone who's heterosexual or who's only homosexual. Is that a bad word now? Is homosexual a bad word? All right. So someone who engages in sex with the same gender.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, we tend to say gay, bisexual, or other men who have sex with men.
Okay. MSM. I just saw that being at this conference.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, in the beginning it was kind of case by case. I was so timid when telling people. I would kind of just awkwardly shove it into whatever conversation I could before a first date. When I realized that the responses weren't going to be super negative, and luckily I was never put in a position where I felt like my physical safety was going to be at risk, which, I realized not everybody is in that same situation. It was like, okay, now let's have this conversation in person. So instead of telling you over text message, I'm going to tell you in person, because I really want to see the way that you react.
And I think it's more than just like seeing them. It's like you pick up on what's happening in them.
Right, there's all that
energy
nonverbal
shift.
communication that takes place, which was really important for me to see. But then I kind of got tired of having the conversation.
Put it on your dating profile.
Yes, that's exactly what I did. Before I worked for NCSD, I came to their conference in 2017. We were here in Alexandria, and there are these things called giant microbes, and they're little stuffed animals of different
STDs.
infections, STDs being some of them, and I got one that was herpes. So I kind of took a picture of it, like, tongue-in-cheek sort of thing, took a picture pointing to it, and I even put it as my Facebook profile picture, and I was like, I came to NCSD annual meeting, and all I got was herpes. Now, most people didn't realize that I already had herpes, like for real had herpes.
I can only imagine the kind of jokes that went around for a while.
Yeah, and that's before I felt comfortable telling friends. I put it on my Facebook as, a kind
Yeah.
of.
Do you find that since coming out publicly that it's made it easier to disclose moving forward, or is it still uncomfortable for you at all?
I don't think so. I mean, if I can get up in a room and 600 people, even if I don't plan on sleeping with any of those 600 people, I feel comfortable just saying, hi, my name's Amanda and I have herpes. It's just, it's like saying, hi, I'm Amanda and I have hazel eyes and brown hair and I'm 5'6". It's just another, like, part of me, but it's not, it doesn't define me.
You
So-
mentioned how just telling someone really helped you with your healing process. Is that like the major contributor to you being able to deal with the challenge of your identity and what you believed about yourself, having done everything right to not get an STD and then all of a sudden make it to the other side of that point, having an STD? Do you feel like there were other things that might have helped you in the healing process?
Certainly talking to people, right? You get the positive reinforcement of everything else that kind of counteracts whatever stigma. And I was going to therapy at the time, so it is something that I talked to, my therapist about.
Did you talk to your therapist about it right away?
Yes,
Okay.
I did. I mean, I had started seeing my therapist when I was in a committed relationship, and that relationship had ended. I was then diagnosed with herpes, so it kind of just felt natural to, like, as we were talking about my relationship status shift, and coming into my own as a queer person, that then also talk about herpes. So I did talk about it with her, and it helped tremendously. I think other things that helped, even without disclosing to people, is that when I heard comments being made, being able to be like, the sex positive way to say this, or the way to have this conversation without being stigmatizing. Even if I wasn't telling them that I had herpes, it was a way to kind of shift the entire conversation around STDs in general. That certainly helped. And then just, getting to a point of getting back into the dating game and feeling desirable again and kind of rebuilding your confidence in that arena and being educated as well. I worked in the STD field, but as we mentioned earlier, I didn't deal a whole lot with herpes other than, some conversations around it in a clinic, but educating myself around the virus. When I had my first outbreak, I had a lot of the rare kind of medical things that also happen. So it wasn't just an outbreak, it was like 10 other things that happened.
What were some of those things? You mean like fever, chills?
Not necessarily fever, chills. It all started because I thought I had a UTI. Wasn't a UTI. And then because they put me on antibiotics for a UTI, I got a yeast infection on top of my first outbreak. I ended up having pelvic inflammatory disease, a uterine infection, like severely swollen lymph nodes in the groin area, and the nerve pain shooting down from my butt cheeks to the tips of my toes. Like, I was laid up in bed for like 2 weeks.
Is this as a result of a misdiagnosis initially?
No, I just, for whatever reason, I have friends who have herpes who just thought it was an ingrown hair. And when like a second or third one popped up.
Your friends are so awesome.
I
They were trying to
know.
protect you.
Right? Like, they were just like, yeah, this was my experience. And I was miserable for 2 to 3 weeks before I like felt somewhat normal again. And then after my outbreak cleared up, there's something that can happen with your urethra where you feel like you have to go to the bathroom, but you can't. And that was also miserable. But it wasn't a UTI. It's a consequence of having this, kind of drastic outbreak.
Yeah.
And I don't remember how I got on this topic.
Oh, it's okay. We're just talking. It doesn't even matter.
But yeah, I mean, my first experience was horrible.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't wish that experience on anybody.
We were going to get to it at some point.
Yeah.
Safety.
Uh-huh.
As far as practicing safe sex with someone who has sex with all genders, right?
Yep.
Okay. What are some of the best practices?
So this is a conversation that I have with all of my partners. I think first and foremost, right, like I tell them. And I tell them that for me, as someone who experiences recurrent outbreaks if I'm not on medication, I make sure to take my medication twice a day, every day. And then with new partners, sure, we use condoms or barrier protection. I know if I'm going to have an outbreak a day or two before a sore comes up, so I can say, okay, not having sex between right now and when it clears.
Do you eliminate all sex or just certain types of sex, or do you avoid the area?
For me, just going through it like a personal thing, I just don't feel comfortable really engaging in sexual activity at that point.
And this is when you know it's coming along.
Yes.
What are some of the signs that you have?
It's the same thing that happened in between feeling like I had a UTI and my first sore coming up. Was feeling like a chafing sensation. And the first time it happened, I thought it was because I was wearing new exercise pants at my hip hop fitness class. And little did I know that like 2 days later, I'd be in the throes of full-blown outbreak. So I still get that sensation before having a recurrent outbreak at this point. So when I feel that coming on, I kind of just eliminate sex.
And your partners are responsive to this. It's like they know what's happening. And
There's no pressure. They're supportive. There's no pressure, no resentment or anything like that. And then, sure, when I get to a point with a partner where maybe I've been with them a while or we've had the conversation and we decide to eliminate barrier protection, then it's, okay, at that point, what other methods are available? And I make sure I'm on my medication and I make sure that I don't have sex during an outbreak. And we go from there.
Okay, so we're just talking about different ways to minimize the risk of transmission to other partners.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now it sounds like to me there's a lot of openness, open communication, and transparency between you and your partners.
Mm-hmm.
I think that speaks volumes to being able to and being safe in disclosing your status. So
Absolutely.
do you have like a filtering mechanism for how, when, and who you disclose to? Are there certain characteristics that you look for in partners, or
Sure.
what?
I mean, so I got bold enough to put it on my dating profile. So not just on my Facebook page as, oh, hey, I have this herpes stuffed animal, but it was, I have herpes. If you aren't comfortable with that, don't bother messaging me. So that was kind of the first thing, was, okay, well, if you've messaged me, I'm going to assume that you're okay with it because it's on my profile. If I felt uncomfortable in the conversation in any sort of way, and it didn't even have to be about sex, right? Like if I sent some sort of stigma around something else or judgment around something else, sometimes you just get a vibe for somebody or they say things that make you uncomfortable, even if it doesn't have to do with sex or STDs, then that's not someone that I'm gonna pursue and tell them that I have herpes.
So there's like a level of open-mindedness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Yeah.
that's one of the sort of filters for a partner for you.
Absolutely. I mean, as someone who identifies as queer, who has, been in the poly space, who has herpes, who works in the sexual health field, like, I feel like there's a lot of things there that could potentially be shamed or judged.
So it's kind of like you just, all right, I work in public health, specifically with sex.
Yep.
And you kind of just like push it,
Right?
push it. And you just
Like
get
it's kind of
closer
like a
to the-
checklist
yeah.
of, there's all of these
Oh,
things that are a part
goodness.
of my identity.
Yes.
And if you're not okay with one of them, then we're not going to be okay. And that's not a partner that I want to pursue.
I heard last night at one of the presentations here at STD Engage, one of the presenters, and I forget the exact name of it, but it was on talking to teens about sex, sexual health. And they mentioned, someone in the audience mentioned, they were like, well, you can make a list of 10 things that make you say yes to a partner. And the partner has to check off 10 things, and then you're a yes. So this conversation really revolved around consent as well.
Absolutely.
So I am a hell yes if all 10 of these check marks are checked off. Because oftentimes we look for red flags, we look for negatives, we look for things to make us say no, rather than looking for the things that make us say hell yes. And I think that that's a very useful exercise, and it made me think about that when you said something you had just said. I can't remember what it was.
My checklist.
Yeah, the checklist. Like
Yeah.
having a checklist for your green light rather than a checklist for, all right, 3 strikes, you're out. Why not 10 check marks, you're in?
Right, and they don't all have to be sex related, right? Like, what are things that make you feel good when you're with another person? What are not only, these are all my kinks and my fetishes, and I want people to be in the same, interested in the same things, but how do you want to feel when you're with someone, right? And if they make you feel that way, or they're interested in the same things, then yeah, that sets a positive tone for things, rather than, like you said, looking for all of these negatives or red flags. You're looking for things to say yes to.
Now, has your relationship style changed at all since your diagnosis?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that because of my history of being in poly relationships, being in the kink world, being diagnosed with herpes, I've learned to communicate a lot better, for sure, and to have open and honest conversations, and helping partners get to that same point, and talking about just, feelings and things that are happening. So I think in that way, my style has changed, but overall, I mean, initially, right? Like initially I stopped dating.
For how long? How long did you shut down dating?
Oh, it was months.
Yeah.
It was months, probably 5 to 6 months. I turned off my online dating profiles. There were a few partners that I had at the time of my diagnosis who were super supportive, and I was able to keep seeing them. And then there were others who completely shut me out, which is fine.
Yeah.
And I had disclosed to a few of the poly folks in my life who didn't want to hear about it. Like, they weren't having their own conversations around STDs, and so when I inserted that conversation into those relationships, it was kind of like hands off. And so I think at that point I was just like, I need to shut down.
Yeah.
I need to kind of take care of myself and not worry about everybody else right now. And then I had that one experience
With the leg.
with the leg,
Yeah, with the leg.
Out at dinner, asking me if he could get herpes because our legs were touching. And it was like, okay, I'm just gonna kind of take control of this, and I'm gonna own it and fumble my way through disclosing until I get it right.
And I think that for a lot of us, it just takes for us to get tired. We just get tired of it. We get tired of the stigma. We get tired of putting all this additional pressure on ourselves, and we just break free. We break ourselves free, and we're just like, you know what? I'm over this. I'm gonna take charge of my sexuality, because sex is awesome. Being able to sexually express yourself and have these kinds of exchanges with other people, like, we desire pleasure, we want human connection. And so oftentimes we put a lot more pressure on ourselves as people who are living with the positive status than the people who we choose to open up and disclose to would even put on us. I can't tell you how many people who, after disclosing, have been like, oh, I have herpes too. I can't tell you how many people are aware and have dated someone in the past with it. How many people don't care? And for those people who have their objections toward it, please don't look at that as a rejection of your character. They're declining your offer. So when you're able to allow yourself to look at it like, okay, here's an offer I'm extending to you, and the other person's looking at the offer and they're just like, no thanks, you have to take it for what it is. The way I see it, our people who are meant to be in our lives in this space of sexual contact, these are people who are either going to also have herpes or be okay with the fact that we have herpes. So that's 2/3 of the possible outcomes of people that you may interact with, that you may want to pursue a romantic sexual relationship with. And when you go into it with that mindset, like, your odds of having progressed a relationship to that point are 66.6%. So when you look at it that way, we winning out here. And the only way that we're losing is if we allow for ourselves to allow that 1/3 to completely overshadow the other 2/3 of possibilities. So take that into consideration. If you're someone who's struggling with your diagnosis to get back in the dating world, make that checklist of things that have to happen in order for you to move forward. And when you have so many, sometimes that takes more experiences with the person, more interactions with the person for you to be able to fill that checklist, but it's worth it. So I don't know, Amanda, we covered everything I wanted to cover. Is there anything that you feel like we may have missed out on or that you want to add to the conversation?
You just mentioned about declining an offer, right? One thing that I always tell folks is that, right, that declining of an offer isn't a reflection on you.
Exactly.
It's not a reflection of who you are as a person, your character, anything like that. It's like you just said, that person declining an offer, it's their choice, and the fact that you're giving them that choice is important. But just remember that what the outcome is isn't a reflection of who you are as a person.
Exactly. All right. How can people get in touch with you?
Sure.
Do you want people to get in touch with you?
Absolutely.
Let me ask that.
Absolutely. I always offer up my email, which is adennison@ncsddc.org. People can feel free to call my office phone, 202-969-0988.
If you're driving, please don't stop
Yeah,
and write this
don't.
down. I will put it in the show notes for different ways that you can get in contact with Amanda.
But I'm always happy to talk to people. I get notes and calls every single week, and I think the more that we have these conversations, the better, the more that we, as people living with or affected by STIs, can have these conversations, the more that will change it kind of in the general population. So,
Absolutely. All right. That concludes this episode of Something Positive for Positive People with Amanda Dennison. Are you a director? What's your title?
Director of Programs and Partnerships
At National Coalition of STD Directors. I'll link to her contact information in the show notes. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can comment on this episode, and I'll get back to you, and we'll get any questions that you may have for Amanda. We'll get those to her. So again, we're live at STD Engage 2019. I want to remind everyone that Waxo is a sponsor of the Something Positive for Positive People podcast. You can go on there, waxoh.com, and check out some of the articles on there. We're on the topic of healthcare for queer identified folks, looking for a way to identify compassionate, empathetic care from medical professionals, and that's why I'm so happy to be able to represent the hashtag We Need a Button campaign. If you're curious about that, want to check that out, there's more information on waxo.com. Till next time, stay sex positive.